The bank was unusually quiet for a weekday morning. Pens scratched paper. Keyboards clicked softly. People stood patiently in line, minds busy with numbers and worries. Then laughter broke the silence. Not friendly laughter. Not polite laughter, cruel laughter. Everyone turned. Behind the main counter stood the branch manager. Confident, well-dressed. Smug in front of him stood Steven Seagal. No expensive suit. No flashy watch. Just simple clothes and calm eyes. The manager didn't even glance at the check Steven placed on the counter. Instead, he scanned Steven slowly, from head to toe. His lips curled into a grin. "Sir," he said loudly, making sure everyone heard, "this bank serves professionals." A few people chuckled nervously. Steven remained silent. The manager leaned back in his chair, enjoying the attention. "Do you even know where you are?" He continued, "This isn't a place for people who look like you." A woman in line shifted uncomfortably. A man near the door frowned. Steven finally spoke, calm and steady. "I just want to deposit my check." That made the manager laugh harder. "Deposit," he scoffed. "You should be grateful if we let you stand in here." Then he waved his hand toward security. "Escort him out. We don't have time for jokes." The room froze. Security hesitated. Steven slowly pushed the check forward again. The manager picked it up, still smirking. But instead of reading it, he ripped it in half. Gasps echoed across the bank. "That's enough," he said. "People like you always try something." Steven didn't react. No anger, no shouting. Just silence. That silence made people uneasy. Phones came out quietly. Whispers filled the air. "Who does that? That's humiliating." The manager tossed the torn check aside and leaned forward. "Now leave before I make this worse." Steven looked around the room calmly, at the people watching, at the staff pretending not to see. Then he took out his phone. The manager laughed again. "Calling for help?" he mocked. "Go ahead. No one's coming for you." Steven didn't respond, and said one sentence. "Put them on the line." In that moment, no one knew it yet. But that phone call was about to change everything. Monday morning always brought a certain energy to Riverstone National Bank. The elderly clerk behind the desk gave him a small, polite smile. Clark leaned over and whispered to another teller. "Watch this," he said. "They always ask for something they can't afford." Steven stepped forward. "Good morning," he said calmly. "I'd like to deposit a check." Clark didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, studying Steven's face as if looking for a joke. Then he smiled. Not warmly, but cruelly. "This bank isn't a charity center," Clark said loudly. Heads turned. Steven remained calm. "I'm not asking for charity," he replied. "I'm asking for service." That answer annoyed Clark. People like Steven weren't supposed to speak with confidence. "You sure you're in the right place?" Clark said. "Accounts here require a certain standard." Steven placed the envelope on the counter. Clark didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "Let me guess," he said. "You don't even have an account with us." Steven met his eyes. "I do." Clark laughed, a sharp, mocking laugh. "People like you always say that." The room grew uncomfortable. A man in line cleared his throat. A woman glanced at her phone, pretending not to notice. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He simply repeated, "I'd like to deposit my check." That calmness only fueled Clark's ego. To him, silence meant weakness. "Fine," Clark snapped. "Let's see what you've got." He finally grabbed the envelope, already convinced it was fake, but the moment he pulled the check out, something shifted. Just for a second, Clark's eyes dropped to the number, and his confidence hesitated. Not disappeared, just shaken. He quickly covered it with laughter. "You expect me to believe this?" he said loudly. Steven tilted his head slightly. "Believe whatever you want," he replied. "Truth doesn't need approval." That sentence landed heavy. A few customers exchanged looks. Clark felt it. And he hated it. Because for the first time that morning, control was slipping. Clark stared at the check again. The number hadn't changed. $750,000. For a brief moment, the noise of the bank faded away. No keyboards, no whispers. Just the pounding of Clark's own heartbeat. This wasn't pocket change. This wasn't a prank. His fingers tightened around the paper. Logic whispered, "Be careful." But pride shouted louder. Clark straightened his suit and forced a laugh. "Nice try," he said, holding the check up like evidence. "You really expect me to believe this is real?" A few employees laughed nervously, unsure whether they were supposed to. Stephen stood still. "I don't expect anything," he replied calmly. "I came to deposit a check." That calmness irritated Clark more than anger ever could. People who were guilty usually explained themselves. They begged. They panicked. Stephen did none of that. Clark leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound threatening. "Do you have any idea how many fake checks we see every week?" he said. "Men who walk in here thinking confidence can replace credibility." Stephen's eyes didn't leave him. "Confidence doesn't replace truth," Stephen said. "It survives without it." A few customers shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. A man near the exit folded his arms. Clark felt the room changing, and it scared him. Fear, when mixed with power, turns into cruelty. Clark slammed the check down on the counter. "This is fake," he announced. "And attempting to pass a fake check is a crime." Gasps spread through the lobby. Stephen raised an eyebrow slightly. "On what basis?" he asked. Clark smiled, sharp and cold. "On the basis of experience," he said, "and appearance." That word hung in the air. Appearance. Everyone knew what he meant. Stephen took a slow breath. "Racism," he said quietly, "is loud because it's afraid." The sentence cut through the room like glass. No one laughed this time. Clark's face flushed red. "How dare you accuse me?" he snapped. "I treat everyone the same." Stephen nodded calmly. "That's the lie people tell themselves." That was it. Clark's control snapped. He grabbed a small lighter from his desk, a cheap novelty he used for candles during power outages. "What are you doing?" a teller whispered. Clark didn't answer. He struck the lighter. The flame danced at the corner of the check. Stephen didn't move. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash. A collective gasp filled the bank. Someone dropped their phone. "That's private property," a man shouted. Clark watched the check burn, his jaw tight. "There," he said. "Problem solved." He let the ashes fall into the trash bin. Silence swallowed the room. Stephen looked at the trash, then back at Clark. "No," he said softly. "You just created one." Clark laughed again, but it sounded hollow now. "You're done here," he barked. "Get out before I call the police." Stephen didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply turned toward the exit. That calm exit disturbed people more than shouting would have. Phones were fully out now. Cameras recording. Whispers spreading. A young employee swallowed hard. "That man," she whispered to a coworker. "He doesn't look broke." "He looks dangerous," the other replied. "Not physically, powerfully." Stephen reached the door. His hand touched the handle. Behind him, Clark straightened his tie, trying to regain control. "Next customer," he shouted. But no one moved. Because everyone felt it. This wasn't over. Not even close. Stephen's hand rested on the door handle. Cold metal, smooth, heavy. Behind him, the bank felt frozen in time. No one spoke. No one moved. The sound of the check burning still lingered in people's minds. The crackle, the smell of paper turning to ash. It wasn't just a financial loss, it was humiliation made public. Stephen stood there for a moment longer, not because he was unsure, but because he was listening. Listening to the room, to the nervous breathing, to the guilt, to the unspoken realization that everyone had witnessed something wrong and done nothing. A woman near the counter lowered her eyes. A man shifted his weight, uncomfortable. The tellers stared at their screens, pretending work could erase what had just happened. Only one person looked directly at Stephen, the elderly clerk. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her pen. She had seen discrimination before. Not always loud, not always cruel, but always damaging. And this time, it had happened right in front of her. Stephen turned his head slightly and met her gaze. She gave a small nod and an apology without words. Stephen nodded back. Then he slowly released the door handle. He didn't leave. That decision alone changed the atmosphere. Whispers grew louder. Why isn't he going? Is he waiting for something? Did you see the amount on that check? Clark noticed the hesitation. It irritated him. Sir, he snapped. I told you to leave. Stephen turned around calmly. I heard you, he said. I'm just making sure everyone else did too. That answer unsettled the room. Clark straightened his posture, sensing eyes on him. He raised his voice. This man tried to commit fraud in my bank, he declared. I handled it professionally. Professional. The word tasted bitter to the people listening. A customer finally spoke. You didn't even verify it. The man said carefully. Clark shot him a glare. This doesn't concern you. Another voice joined. You burned his check. Clark's jaw tightened. For security reasons, he said. The excuses sounded thin. Stephen remained silent, watching. That silence was doing more damage than shouting ever could. A young woman near the window whispered to her friend. He doesn't look angry. No, her friend replied. He looks prepared. Clark felt sweat form under his collar. He wasn't used to being questioned. Power had always protected him, but power needs agreement to survive, and the agreement was slipping. Stephen slowly reached into his pocket. Clark stiffened. Don't do anything stupid, he warned. Stephen pulled out his phone. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just calm. The screen lit up. The room leaned in unconsciously. Stephen glanced at the name on the screen, then looked up at Clark. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, Stephen said. Clark scoffed. Calling your lawyer? He mocked. Good luck. Stephen didn't respond. He answered the call. Yes, he said simply. I'm at the branch. A pause. His eyes remained on Clark. Yes, he continued. There's been an incident. People held their breath. Stephen turned the phone slightly outward. Put them on speaker. Clark laughed too loudly. This is ridiculous, he said. You're embarrassing yourself. But his voice cracked at the end. Stephen pressed the button. The call connected. A clear, confident voice filled the bank. Mr. Seagal were on the line. Every head turned. Clark's smile froze. The air shifted, because in that moment, everyone felt it. This wasn't a bluff. And whatever was coming next was about to expose everything. The voice from the phone echoed clearly through the bank. Mr. Seagal. Thank you for waiting. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't uncertain. It was the kind of voice people obey without realizing why. Stephen held the phone steady. Yes, he replied calmly. I'm inside the Riverstone branch. Clark laughed nervously, waving a hand. This is some kind of joke, he said. Anyon can make a call. But his eyes had already betrayed him. They darted from the phone to Stephen's face. Searching for cracks, the voice continued. We've been informed about an incident involving a destroyed financial instrument. A murmur rippled through the lobby. Destroyed. That word carried weight. Stephen nodded slightly. Yes, he said. A check was burned in front of witnesses. Clark straightened his back. Sir, he interrupted loudly. I am the branch manager here. I handled a fraudulent situation. The voice paused, then responded, colder now. Mr. Clark, it said, we are not speaking to you. Silence hit the room. Clark swallowed. Stephen spoke again. Please confirm what I asked earlier. Another pause, then the words that changed everything. Mr. Seagal, the voice said, you are listed as the majority shareholder of Riverstone National Bank, holding 51% ownership. The bank froze. Time seemed to stop. A woman covered her mouth, someone whispered. Oh my God. Clark staggered back as if the floor had shifted. That's not possible, he muttered. He doesn't. The voice cut in sharply. Mr. Clark, this information is public record. Stephen lowered the phone slightly, meeting Clark's eyes. You judged me by how I looked, Stephen said calmly. Not by who I was. Clark's lips trembled. I didn't know, he stammered. Stephen shook his head. That's the point. The phone voice continued. Our legal team is reviewing the incident. Security footage has already been flagged. Camaras Clark glanced up at the ceiling. Too late. Customers whispered openly now. He owns the bank. And they burned his check? This is unbelievable. Stephen turned slightly, addressing the room. I didn't come here to prove who I am, he said. I came here to see how people are treated when no one important is watching. The words hit harder than anger. The elderly clerk nodded slowly. Clark's knees weakened. Please, he said, voice cracking. I can explain. Stephen didn't raise his voice. You already did, he replied. The phone voice spoke again. Mr. Seagal, would you like us to proceed with disciplinary protocol? Stephen paused, looked around. At the embarrassed customers, at the silent staff, at the one clerk who had shown respect. Yes, Stephen said finally. Proceed. Clark collapsed into a chair. The weight of his actions finally settled. Stephen ended the call. The silence afterward was heavy, but different now. Not tense, inevitable. Because the truth had arrived, and it had changed everything. The call ended. The line went dead. But the silence it left behind was louder than any noise before it. Clark sat frozen in his chair, staring at the desk as if it might save him. His expensive suit suddenly looked too tight, too uncomfortable. The confidence he wore so proudly just minutes earlier had vanished. I didn't know who you were, he said again, barely above a whisper. Stephen stood a few feet away, calm still. You shouldn't need to, Stephen replied evenly. Those words settled into the room like a verdict. Clark looked up desperately. I treat all customers the same, he insisted weakly. I was just doing my job. Stephen shook his head slowly. No, he said. You were doing what felt safe when you thought no one powerful was watching. No one argued. Because everyone had seen the truth. The front doors opened. 2 security supervisors and a regional compliance officer walked in. Their expressions were serious, professional, final. Mr. Clark, one of them said, please step away from the desk. Clark stood slowly. His movements were heavy now, as if every step carried the weight of what he had lost. Stephen turned toward the staff. I want to be clear, he said calmly. This isn't about revenge. He gestured toward the lobby. This is about standards. The compliance officer nodded. We've already initiated an internal review, she said. Your actions violated multiple policies. Clark's shoulders slumped. Stephen's gaze moved across the tellers. Most looked down, ashamed. Then his eyes landed on the elderly clerk. She met his gaze, nervous but honest. You, Stephen said gently. She froze. Yes, sir. You treated me like a person, he said. When you didn't have to. Her eyes filled with tears. Stephen turned back to the compliance officer. She will be the acting branch manager, he said. Effective immediately. Gasps filled the bank. The elderly clerk covered her mouth. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Stephen smiled slightly. Say yes, he replied. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Clark was escorted toward the door. As he passed Stephen, he stopped. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Not because of who you are, but because of what I did. Stephen nodded once. Remember this feeling, he said. Let it change you. Clark was led out. The doors closed behind him. The bank felt different now. Lighter. Stephen addressed the room one last time. Respect shouldn't depend on status, he said. If it does, it isn't respect. People nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Stephen picked up his coat. I'll return another day, he said calmly, when things are done right. And with that, he walked out, not as an owner, but as a man who had restored dignity to a room that had forgotten it. The bank returned to its routine, keys tapped, printers hummed, lines moved forward, but nothing was the same. People who had witnessed the incident carried it with them, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Steven Seagal didn't stay to receive praise. He didn't wait for applause, because the point was never recognition. It was reflection. Outside the bank, sunlight washed over the glass doors. Stephen paused for a moment, breathing in the calm air. Power had spoken, not through shouting, but through restraint. Inside, the new acting manager stood quietly behind the desk, still processing. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't challenged authority. She had simply chosen decency, and that had changed everything. Racism doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it laughs, sometimes it hides behind policy and procedure. But its damage is always the same. It humiliates. It divides. It convinces good people to stay silent. That silence is what gives it strength. Stephen's presence had broken that silence, not with anger, but with exposure, because when racism is revealed in the light, it shrinks. The truth is simple. Respect is not earned by wealth. Dignity is not decided by clothing. Human value does not come with a title. The bank manager believed power gave him permission. He was wrong. Real power is the ability to remain calm when disrespected. That day, a man lost his job. But more importantly, a room full of people learned something far greater. They learned that character reveals itself in moments of comfort and in moments of challenge. They learned that judging a stranger says more about the judge than the judged. And they learned that the quietest person in the room may carry the greatest authority. If you've ever been dismissed because of how you look, if you've ever been judged before you spoke, if you've ever been treated as less without reason, this story is for you. And if you've ever stayed silent while witnessing discrimination, let this be a reminder. Silence chooses sides. Respect doesn't need to be loud. Justice doesn't need to be cruel. It only needs to be consistent. Type no to racism. If you believe respect is for everyone, type dignity. If you believe power should be accountable. And tell us where you're watching from, because every voice matters. Until next time, remember, never judge a book by its cover. Because sometimes, the man you ignore owns the building.